Welcome to this talk. Sort of necessary intervention in the scheme of things in terms of the uses and abuses of identity for public life by Samir Gandesha. Samir for a long time, and we reconnected around my own work on critical theory Marcuse recently a couple of years ago, and so I was really glad to see that the Socialist Project, which is of course a great going concern, as you all know, and sponsors and does a whole bunch of different kinds of things, including talks such as this in the Capitalism Workshop. That Samir was asked to be a presenter to speak at the Capitalism Workshop series, and that Greg asked me to introduce Samir, which I'll try to keep pretty brief. I'll just mention briefly that he's the director of the Institute of Humanities at Simon Fraser, where he's been for many years now, for some years. And there's a whole bunch of interdisciplinary stuff similar to the social and political thought program at York, I suppose, and which Greg and I are also part of. And in addition to being in poli-sci, some of Samir's recent publications have touched on really important issues in terms of populism, the critical theory analysis of the current cultural conjuncture, which has always included for Samir an important kind of political economy component as well, which is where the capitalism part comes in, I think, too. And so for a long time he's been interested, of course, in Adorno and critical theory, in social psychology and culture, and how those things relate to capitalism and the political economy and the moment that we're in. He's of course written recently on neoliberalism in Logos, for example, a couple of years ago, where he engaged in a dialogue with Axel Honneth, a little commentary on Honneth's work. And recently he's written The Aesthetic Marx in 2017, The Spell of Capital, Reification, and Spectacle, which was also 2017, I think, a couple of years ago. And he's working on a book currently, which I've just had the pleasure of reading the introduction of, called Specters of Fascism, which talks about a very interesting discussion of the evolution of different ideas globally of fascism that don't necessarily all correspond to the fascism of the 1930s, of course, but that have evolved and are throwing up similar tropes and issues in terms of the current global situation that we're in. And so that is coming up from Pluto, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And that's going to be a must-read. So I'm going to just turn it over in a couple of seconds to Samir, and then stand aside. And once he's finished with his talk, I'll just loosely moderate. And maybe I'll ask a question or two to start us off, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion from the audience. So without further ado, would you join me, please, in welcoming Samir Gandesha?
Thanks so much for that most flattering of introductions. Thanks also to Greg and Tanner for having me here, for putting the talk together. I'm really in very distinguished company, and these are really important talks you're hosting here, and I'm very excited to see this kind of regeneration, in particular of intellectual activity. And I think this is really key, that we maintain robust and critical forms of debate and discussion at the intellectual level. I think this is key to any kind of progressive politics, but not necessarily, accepted as something that is taken as given today. So what I'd like to do today is just make a few introductory remarks. I've got a kind of outline here of what I want to talk about, so just to give you a bit of orientation. I just want to make a few introductory remarks, situating the talk, and maybe trying also to answer a certain kind of skeptical question as to why I'm making this kind of intervention now at this moment. I think that requires some justification. That justification has to do with item number 2 here, which is the uncanny return of fascism today, and it speaks to this other project that I've got going. I want to then try and explain a little bit of what identity politics is. I mean, it's a term we use all the time without really grasping what it is we're talking about. So maybe sort of look at some ways in which it's been understood, and talk then also about how it plays out in praxis, because I think these two things are a little bit different. One of the key things about identity politics that has to be remembered, I think, is that it is very closely tied to this question of intersectionality, which I think in theoretical terms, in conceptual terms, is something that ought not to be too controversial on the left. But I think what then does get controversial, again, is how it plays out. And so I hope that my approach will come across as what it's intended to be, which is a critique, but an immanent critique, rather than a transcendental critique or a critique from outside. I think what you see on the right is a dismissal of anything like intersectionality, anything like the claims made by people who engage in identity politics as at best frivolous and at worst something very nefarious and divisive and separationist and so on. I want to try and do something a little bit different to say, well, some of the claims made within the context of identity politics are very valuable and very well worth taking seriously, but how do those claims, in a sense, come into contradiction with either themselves, with some of their premises, or indeed with their praxis on the ground. So it's a sympathetic critique, in other words. It's not a dismissal. Then I'm going to try and just draw some conclusions and then hopefully open it up for again a kind of robust discussion. So some of the introductory comments of mine would be really as follows. I was initially invited last November to give some remarks, or to make some remarks on a panel devoted to launching Asad Haider's book, Mistaken Identity, which I'm sure a number of you in the room have read and thought about. It's really been quite widely discussed. It's a terrific book, and I'll have some things to say about it in what follows. I'm a bit critical of it, but I think it raises some of the key questions in a very effective way. So that's why it's worth my while engaging with. So I was invited to speak there in London about the book, and then I gave another iteration of it in Karlsruhe to an art critical crowd at an art institution. And then I went to Paris and I presented it there with a group that was largely comprised of people, I think, of North African descent who were living in Parisians with this background. And I think it's in each of those contexts it sparked some different kinds of responses. I thought that would be it. I thought, okay, move on. I'm not going to give the talk again. But then something very interesting happened. In the early summer, I was contacted by a fellow by the name of Chin Banerjee. Some of you might know the name, especially for those of you who've been to Vancouver. He's a professor emeritus of English, an expert in Shakespeare, and has also been very politically engaged. And he has been principally engaged with an organization called SANSAD, which is a South Asian network for secularism and democracy. Today, very important project, as you can imagine, and also the Harish Sharma Foundation. Very progressive organizations that are active in the community. And he approached me and said, look, I just had a terrible experience. We were trying to organize anti-fascist resistance in Vancouver, and the very first meeting that we had didn't last more than 15 minutes because it just degenerated into a shouting match. Women of color were essentially yelling at this other would-be organizer who happened to be a white woman. And he just was absolutely flummoxed by this. Here we have a very serious and pressing problem of the rise of the far right, globally and also and especially in this country. We've seen how the institutional racism goes to the very top of the Canadian establishment still, despite representations otherwise. And here we have a situation in which they can't even organize against fascism because of these identity questions, which just keep, it seems, popping up. So what Chin wanted me to do then is to have a little small group discussion with a group of activists based on some of the analysis that I had made in the discussion of the Hyder book. So I agreed, and so I presented this again. So that last bit of the context is really by way of explaining why this is a talk about identity politics rather than, say, the question of racism. Why isn't directly spending all of its time talking about some of the arguments in the book on fascism. I think the two are really quite closely and deeply linked, precisely for this organizational reason. That the left is divided against itself. It has historically been the party of universalism. The right, which has always been, in a sense, the far right, which has always been the party of radical particularism, has somehow managed to make things work where they can talk about a kind of movement at a global level, right? Instigated principally by Steve Bannon. So there's this bizarre kind of inversion happening, where the far right seems to be able to get its shit together, and the left's house is as divided against itself as it's ever been. So hence the need for this kind of an intervention and discussion. Also for people who know some of the stuff that I've done, I've, in a somewhat risky way, taken on the question of free speech, free expression, and have argued to, not an absolutist position, but one that maximizes its parameters as far as is possible. This is risky today because today, for some reason, for clear reasons, I think, I mean, it doesn't, bear too much discussion, the far right has appropriated for itself free speech and free expression. However, to argue today that this is what the left needs to embrace is to put yourself into a kind of position of being a quasi-fascist, right? But I think this, as well as questions of cultural appropriation, as well as questions of safe spaces and trigger warnings, are all bound together, and the thread that binds them together is identity politics, right? It's the assertion of identity in a particular kind of way that is authoritarian, and that it is a way of closing down spaces, right? And we need, like this space here, I mean, a physical space for the left to have discussions like this, but we also need a kind of mental space, also a space of reasons within which we can make claims and counterclaims and have discussions. And this seems to be less and less possible as I'll go through and as I'll explain. So these are tied up for me very much together. The next point I would make by way of introduction is that there's a lot of discussion in the mainstream media amongst radical commentators and critics that what we're seeing is a kind of return to the 1930s. This is a common kind of trope. I think it's quite deeply mistaken. There are many differences between the current situation and the 1930s. The central one being that in the rise of fascism in the 20s and the 1930s, what we see is really a political movement or set of movements on the basis of a failed revolution, right? We see a real challenge at this time to capitalist property relations by an organized, radical, revolutionary working class and its institutions. Today, that is not the case. It's a really important difference. I would rather say that there's a connection between the 1930s, or the contemporary period, and the 1970s rather than the 1930s. Why? Because then, as now, you have a particular collision of a political and an economic, socioeconomic crisis. In the 1970s, particularly in Britain, one of the birthplaces of neoliberalism, you have a refugee crisis from 1972-73. This, in a sense, is one of the personal dimensions of the talk, insofar as my family was expelled in 72, my extended family was expelled in 72 by the Amin dictatorship and ended up in Britain. And that was one of the reasons for a spike in the rise of the fortunes of the far right at that time. The National Front and British movement started to gain a lot of headway, especially in the municipal elections, and certainly on the street. Sort of skinhead presence on the street was very clear. 73 as well was the OPEC crisis, and it really accelerated the contradictions of the Keynesian model. And those two things combined to give you the kind of authoritarian populism of Margaret Thatcher. And this is very well, I mean, the best writer on this is, of course, Stuart Hall, his term, authoritarian populism. But I think how prescient that analysis was only becomes clear, in a sense, decades later. We can see the true authoritarian face of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is, in a sense, justified as a way of avoiding authoritarianism, really, by its advocates, like Hayek and like the ordo-liberal school. It's a way to forestall the return of the authoritarian state. But as we're seeing, especially in Brazil, this is not the case, right? It's the exact opposite. So then, as now, you have a political and an socioeconomic crisis colliding and producing very similar kinds of political formations. You have 9/11, which, as Condoleezza Rice argued in April of 2002, a wonderful opportunity for the realignment of geopolitical realities. And then, of course, the financial crash of and near meltdown of the global financial system, 2007, 2008, which then produces what we're seeing today globally. So I think, again, there are these connections. And I think the political response to this was really interesting in Britain. You had, at the level of, especially at the level of street politics and popular culture, you had a kind of politics of alliance. Black and Asian and white kids, young people working together to combat fascism in the form of the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism. And I think that the kind of mixtures you had of musical styles and of scenes and of venues could seem, well, this is, a little, it's important, but it's not real politics. And I think it is really important, especially when we look at politics through the lens of affect and feeling, and how bodies relate to one another in specific spaces. This is very important. It's hard to imagine, though, from the standpoint of the present, those kinds of formations today, because everything is so radically divisive and divided, right? And I think that is one of the things that has really, in a sense, motivated my attention to identity politics and its profound contradictions and problems. The last thing I'd say is that one can understand that specifically in terms of the preface that Foucault writes to Anti-Oedipus, where he talks about the book as a kind of introduction to a non-fascist life. And there's several of the points that he makes there in terms of what this non-fascist life presented in this text looks like are really quite insightful, again, from the standpoint of the present. So that we need to free political action from all unitary and totalizing paranoia. Right? It's interesting, unitary totalizing paranoia. Develop action, thought, and desires by proliferation, juxtaposition, and disjunction, and not by subdivision. And this is a really crucial point, pyramidal hierarchization. So you have this kind of hierarchy with different sort of political different forms of, let's say, militancy arranged in this way, and to really emphasize the positive and not the negative, or positivity rather than negativity. Now, I think with the Adornians in the audience, and there are a few, this is going to catch in some throats, but there's a way of reconciling this. We can maybe talk about that in the discussion period. And turn away from sad militancy. The last is, the very last one, the seventh point that Foucault makes is to not become enamored of power. And I think that this is really what's motivating me. I wrote this piece on neoliberal personality, where I say that the very much at the heart of the neoliberal personality is this identification with the aggressor. And this happens on the right, and I think there's a tendency on the left. And make no mistake, I'm not equating left and right. I think there are some authoritarian tendencies within the left, very much along the lines of what Foucault's identifying in this preface. Again, this is, I think, quite a controversial point, that it's something that we can take up. And in fact, when I was speaking in Toronto at the conference that Terry magnificently organized on Marcuse, it was a Marcuse Association meeting, I talked about the idea of left fascism. This was a discussion that Adorno and Marcuse had about certain elements of the students' movement, and I said, well, there's some resonance of that today, and we can get into that discussion. So that's essentially what I wanted to talk about in terms of my introductory remarks. I think that second point was also, in a way, touched upon, and I'll come back to that. But there's one key aspect of the discussion. So I've got, it's like a palimpsest. There's all kinds of writings. In a nutshell, so if we're not seeing the repetition of the 20s and 30s style fascism, what we are perhaps seeing is what Samir Amin has identified in 2014, that this is in a condition of socioeconomic crisis, a categorical rejection of he says democracy, but I'd say liberal democracy, in the name of a collective identity that's often embodied in the will of a given leader. So this is his idea of what fascism represents today, and I think he's essentially right on most things there in his understanding of fascism. So and as you've probably inferred from my reference to Foucault, although Foucault is a little bit more equivocal and ambiguous on this point, I think that we can't fight fascism if, especially our understanding of fascism is along these lines laid down by Samir Amin, if we don't take seriously some notion of a defense of democratic, we should say radical democratic politics. In the 30s, there might have been a tendency, I think there certainly was a tendency to say, well, let's suspend that question. In the 20s, let's suspend that question because what we have here is a revolutionary situation, right? And so maybe emphasizing democracy in an unmediated way at that time, that becomes a question of strategy and tactics. But today, I don't think it's at all in question. It's something that must be insisted upon. And I think the dimensions of identity politics that I want to draw are militate against that, militate very, very firmly against that. Okay, so I just want to run through down that. Oh, there's my quote. But defining identity politics, we can of course spend a couple of weeks just talking about what identity means. Of course, we can't do that, but one of the things we can go about this, or one of the ways in which we can go about this, is to say identity is really, in a sense, a possibility of understanding a person's political commitments from their experience of oppression. Their oppression is indexed to their subject position within a given set of social relations. One subject position is a function of the operation of what Althusser calls interpolation, or the manner in which one is hailed or called by coercive and ideological apparatuses. And here's his definition of interpolation, which a number of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, but it's worth going back to this, because I think this definition then requires some differentiation. So Althusser says, I shall then suggest that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects. Among the individuals, it recruits all of them, or transforms the individuals into subjects. It transforms them all by that very precise operation which I have called interpolation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing, hey, you there, right? So this is his very famous understanding of how we are constituted, how we as individuals are constituted as subjects, meaning both locus of action and agency, but then also the idea of being subjected to power. So it's this kind of ambivalence of both simultaneously. But I think this is such a good example because of what is not there. I mean, he's talking about the police. So a key dimension here of subject formation, of subjectification, is the fact that we're not all called by the police in the same way. We're not all called equally by the police. Some of us, if we're called by the police, will be given a warning and sent on our way. Others are called by the police, and that's the end of their lives, right? They are brutalized and murdered or disappeared. And this then is indexed to difference. Yeah? Are you Latino? Are you African American? Black? Are you South Asian? What context are you in? So this is in a sense what the complications, this is in a sense what identity politics really speaks to, is that differentiation. How does power operate differently according to different systems of oppression? Right? And you have a kind of famous definition then of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, who says, essentially police violence is represented as almost exclusively targeting black men rather than black women. Their experience is elided, as is discrimination in employment, where, for example, a given, say, factory might hire black men to work on the factory floor, but white women to work in the office above. But black women's particular experiences with unemployment, underemployment, gets elided. So this is a way of addressing these absences. There's even something called, and people might be more familiar with this than me, red intersectionality, which is something that I actually learned about through one of the chapters in the book by a colleague of mine at UBC, Patricia Barkaskas, who's a Métis lawyer, and did a beautiful chapter on the way in which, in a sense, contemporary fascism is anticipated by forms of settler colonialism and genocide. Really a kind of discussion that builds on Aimé Césaire's understanding that, in fact, what fascism is the application of what the colonized have historically experienced to European societies. Arendt takes up something that Enzo Traverso in his book, The Origins of Nazi Violence, also takes up quite brilliantly. So this then, to get back though behind Kimberly Crenshaw's discussion, let's say the originary discussion, as it were, of identity politics, as Hyder points out, happens with the Combahee River Collective and their discussion. Now, you don't have to go through it all, but I'll just pick out, I'll just read out the second paragraph, because it is also important for Hyder's discussion here, on the idea of insurgent universality. So this focusing, or maybe I should just turn this way. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In the case of black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that have preceded us that anyone is more worthy of liberation than ourselves. We reject pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. And I think this is really crucial. I was telling Terry about this conference that I'm participating in next week in honor of Atu Sechiotu, former teacher of mine, brilliant, who's taught, I'm sure, others in the room, brilliant political philosopher, and he's written a book called Left Universalism, Africa-centric essays, and he has an essay in there on the retrieval of the human. He feels that, after the kind of post-structuralist turn, Althusser and his anti-humanist reading of Marx and Foucault, it's important to reclaim some notion of humanity. And you have this here, interesting, right in the Combahee River Collective's statement. So I think this is important, and I want to draw attention to it. Here we have sort of a more structural dimension of the argument, which essentially shows this is the early form of intentionality, of intersectionality, where you have an understanding that what needs to be transformed are the material conditions of these various forms, various structures of oppression. So I think that is, in a sense, the concept, as it were, against which one can challenge a little bit the practice of contemporary identity politics. This is the way in which the immanent critique works. And drawing upon this statement of Marx's in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he's really talking about the conditions, social conditions within Germany and how they relate to German philosophy's own understanding of itself. He says, these petrified relations must be forced to dance by singing their own tune to them. Now, I'm far from saying that what we have in the Combahee River Collective statement are petrified relations, but there is a degree of petrification, if I can put it this way, in terms of the non-practice of the political principles that are stated there. In fact, some of those principles are a little problematic as well. At the very end of the statement, there's a citation of a book by Robin Morgan called Sisterhood is Powerful. And it reads in the following way, and it's a little bit in tension with how I've been describing the statement so far. I haven't the faintest notion what possible revolutionary role white heterosexual men could fulfill, since they are the very embodiment of reactionary vested interest power. Okay, so we go from structures to now looking at individual white heterosexual men, and one could argue that this is what gives rise to the kind of call-out culture that today seems endemic on the left, and therefore subverts liberation struggles, the ones that they are advocating. Moreover, is it also not the case that white heterosexual working class males have an interest in transforming capitalism, even if at the start they may have powerful investment initially in racist and patriarchal systems of domination? Is there not contestation over their own positions, their own contradictory position within the structure of heterosexual, patriarchal capitalism? Surely there must be, otherwise there's really no place for, an alliance-based politics that includes significant aspects of the working class. So this is a key, I think, a key problem here that I'm trying to identify. And then I think gets illuminated in some of the examples that I want to pull up. So intersectionality in practice. So again, the argument is, so the idea, the theory, let's say, of intersectionality is valuable and ought not to be thrown out, baby with the bathwater, but the practice needs to be perhaps challenged in light of that theory, and maybe and maybe vice versa. So I'm just going to go through some examples quickly. I don't want to dwell on them. Some of you will be familiar, most of you will be familiar with all these examples. So especially this one, people aware of this controversy that exploded here in this city. Sky Gilbert, founder of Buddies in Bad Times Theater, a very important institution for the queer community, let's say for the left more generally, who is roundly criticized, to say the least, for a couple of pieces he wrote critiquing Vivek Charya's most recent book. I won't go into the details, I'm sure people are familiar with it, but I think I'd like to just draw attention to what's going on here, and that is, what's going on is that you have those who, in a sense, most affected by intersecting forms of domination, who are then most empowered to criticize others, essentially, and who are, in a sense, protected from having their, let's say, their works, their expressions, their points of view challenged. In no way can one defend, advocate attacking a person ad hominem attack, completely counterproductive. However, we should be in a position still today where if somebody makes X claim or writes a book or an article or a play, those should be open for critical evaluation and discussion. What's crucial about Sky Gilbert in particular is his historic work for the queer community, which, because of two pieces he's written, is completely elided. That history is forgotten, and it then becomes a contributing factor. Those gestures contribute to the machinery of amnesia and distance from history and historical struggles. And we're left in this eternalized now, right? Internalized present. We have no real history. We have no historical sense of the struggles that have led to, let's say, contemporary gains and contemporary losses. And if we have that, we really have no then map of where we are to go in the future. So this, I think, contributes to that kind of logic. We've got this much publicized example of the work of Victor Onatoff, Life of Washington mural, George Washington High School. He's a communist muralist, comrade of Diego Rivera, whose work was, I think, one of the first. This mural was one of the first to depict, one of the founding fathers of the Republic in a less than flattering light, literally giving the directions for the westward expansion of the Republic and the appropriation of indigenous lands. Now, because this did not depict indigenous peoples, and because some of his other work didn't depict slaves in an empowered way, this was taken to be insulting to these communities. So there was and still remains advocates who want the work to be destroyed or covered up and painted over, because it's hurtful to those communities. Now, I don't want to diminish that the feeling of hurt, but at the same time, there is another kind of hurt that happens when history is covered over like this, especially by one of our own. A critical depiction of history. There is a tremendous, let's say, harm involved in that. And again, it's part of the machinery of forgetting, which ultimately doesn't help those students who feel in that moment, in the immediacy of that affective response, hurt. So it's not going to help them in the long run, I would argue. A different kind of response was by this artist also from the Bay Area, Dewey Crumpler, who at first, when he first saw the mural, was shocked by it. And he didn't feel comfortable with it and thought at the time that maybe it should go. But then on further reflection, in an interview, at least this is what he says that I was actually quite shocked by this, and the reason for this is I'd never seen George Washington depicted in this way. And so when I realized what was at issue, what was at the heart of the affect, as it were, he revised his view. It shouldn't be painted over, but what we need is some other kind of, let's say, a counterpoint, a counterpuntal perspective. So now you have his multi-ethnic heritage, which is, let's say, a much more empowering depiction of these communities right across from the previous mural. So you then have a kind of force field established, and I think this is quite an interesting sort of response, right? And then there's, of course, the Dana Schutz case. If people come across this one, heard anything about it, it is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. We can go into it in just a second. This was a painting, as you can see, entitled Open Casket, without the opening quote marks. And it was included in the Whitney Biennale, a very prestigious exhibition, and it was painted by Dana Schutz, who's a white artist. Right? And so what happened is that this immediately provoked, and this was just after a year or two of African Americans being murdered on the streets, the formation and accelerated activism of Black Lives Matter, a real awareness of the extent, the depth of anti-Black racism in the United States. So it's a very charged context, but here you have a situation in which there were different kinds of responses, one which I'm going to go into in detail in just a second, by a mixed race artist, Hannah Black, who at the time was based in Germany, but she's from the United Kingdom, who argued that the painting should be removed and destroyed. And then you also had another interesting kind of response by this Black painter, Parker Bright, who at first engaged in this action where he would stand in front of the painting and obscure the painting's view from the audience members. And then, according to one of the curators, what would happen is people would go, well, so, what's the deal? Why are you standing here? I mean, he does have, I think, black death spectacle on the back of his t-shirt, so it's a little bit clear, what he's doing, but there was engagement with him. So why exactly are you doing this? What's going on? And so he had apparently very productive discussions with people who would then, in a sense, engage him and the painting. And again, it's a sort of a field of force that was established. The meaning of the painting could not be simply self-contained within it, but overflowed it, as it were, and entered into the space. He then went on to paint himself performing the action with Black Death spectacle. And it's brilliant. I mean, everything's in the title. Confronting my own possible death. So arguing, obviously, that this isn't something I can just look at dispassionately in a work of art in a museum, it's detached to the contemplation, but this is a very real possibility for somebody like me. And so he really drew into the discussion the way in which the way in which the stakes were pretty high and maybe not fully realized by somebody like Dana Schutz, right? But he didn't argue for the work's destruction. And the reason I pull out these examples is because I think that there's a vision of intersectionality and of identity politics that shows that that holds that we need to we strengthen our movement by looking at different forms of exclusion, of elision, of domination, invisibilization. These things, I think, are really important and valuable contributions. At the same time, how it plays out in these three examples is you have this move to silence, or you could say maybe answering a silence or perceived silence by another kind of silence. There is a kind of mirroring of an authoritarianism, which is, in a sense, being analyzed as part of the problem, right? So the authoritarian response is a solution that, in a way, to some extent, mirrors the problem. So I want to get into it a little bit. I've got an analysis of this, and then a few more concluding things to say, and then I'll be done. We'll open it up for discussion. So let's get back here to Open Casket. Okay, so this is just part of the thing that I've written on Haider, but it gets into the Dana Schutz and puts some things out on the table. So while Haider's impulse to try to understand the intertwined nature of race and class is correct, it is important to emphasize the way in which race cannot, in any straightforward way, be understood in terms of Stuart Hall's Althusserian formulation, which Heider himself draws upon as the modality in which class is lived. People must be familiar with that, that statement. This is one of the very few times I disagree with Stuart Hall. In contemporary identity politics, race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other forms of identity or identification demand recognition and affirmation, and in societies constituted in part by the misrecognition or non-recognition of these identities, this is understandable and legitimate. To some extent, at least, and we can talk about the condition that I've put in there as well. And this is especially the case with trans identities that have asserted and reasserted themselves in recent years with particular force. This is what I think what's at the heart of trans politics is about a certain kind of moral, legal, social recognition. Right? Proletarian identity, however. And in this, not unlike the condition of homelessness, and also I think you could say the indigenous relation to the land, cannot be understood in quite the same way. Thought in radical terms, such a form of identity is not simply an empirical sociological category, but manifests a form of structural negativity that as such demands its own negation. Just as people who are homeless, far from wanting their homeless condition to be recognized and affirmed as a kind of identity, they want it to be eliminated through, amongst other things, the provision of adequate housing. Capital cannot properly include the proletariat on the basis of whose unremunerated surplus labor its own expanded reproductionist premise. In other words, while other identity categories have an interest in recognition and affirmation that arguably can be met within capitalism, proletariat identity, like homeless identity, and I think really take indigenous claims seriously, these other forms of identity really cannot. They demand a fundamental transformation of the social order. The realization of proletarian identity is ultimately negative rather than affirmative. Proletarian identity, unlike most other identities, has an interest in its own self-dissolution along with that of class society as a whole. I would suggest that rather than an individualistic and rights-based model, as Heider argues in invoking Butler and Wendy Brown in their critiques, identity politics is based on a particular reified account of experience. Identity politics entails a proprietary relation to a reified form of experience, and I think just anticipating the discussion of work of art, I think this is why this is in a sense proof that experience is so crucial. So identity politics entails a proprietary relation to a reified form of experience, unchanging, fixed, substantive, that can be understood as a possession or property of a given group that is paradoxically constituted by that very form of experience. In German, the word for authenticity is Eigentlichkeit, and is closely associated with the word for property, Eigentum. Identity politics often makes a claim to authenticity. Such claims are closely linked to questions of ownership rights. This is why identity politics is often embroiled in questions of cultural appropriation. One suspects that despite his telling anecdotes, it is far from clear that Heider fully appreciates how deleterious and fractious identity politics can be for left politics. I mean, his examples are student battles on the campus of UC Santa Cruz, particularly over the language of occupation. Right? And he makes some good points that we used to talk about polysemy and the way in which words can mean very different things depending on the context and how they're interpreted and so on. And he's saying now all of a sudden we've forgotten that, and occupation only means one thing: the occupation of indigenous lands. We can't use that. So these are the kinds of debates, but it goes quite a bit beyond this, And I'm not really that interested in what happens on U.S. college campuses, really. There are other things to worry about more than that. So, I mean, one of the things that we've confronted is, of course, the deployment of the language of intersectionality in Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. I think this is the most pressing. It's in fact the thing that sparks Heider's book, but there could be more discussion of those kinds of politics. And if you've seen this most recent thing that came up it was in Boris Johnson's first day as Prime Minister in question period. It was Gandesha, who's the MP for Slough, who got up and made this brilliant, impassioned speech demanding an apology from Johnson for his letterbox comment and other things that he had said, very racist things. We worry about Justin Trudeau's foibles, but in Britain, believe me, it is intense, I think, the way in which racism is just rolled out. And what did he get back by way of response? No apology, but rather, look at how diverse our cabinet is. It's filled with the most reactionary people of color you can imagine, but it's diverse. It's diverse. So I think, it is at one level quite funny, but at another level it's dead serious. And the right has just learned how to play this game. And it goes all the way back, not to 2016, but of course the compassionate conservatism, right, of George W. Bush, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice. And so they learned the lesson a long time ago. So I think this is important to keep in mind. So such a proprietary relation to experience is especially well exemplified by Hannah Black's infamous open letter attacking white painter Dana Schutz's depiction of Emmett Till, the African-American boy beaten to death by white supremacists, for allegedly looking the wrong way at a white woman, put that in quotes, in 1955. And it's called Open Casket, as I've already shown you. The painting, the letter reiterates several times, must go. Co-signed by some 47 other artists, curators, and critics, it demands not only that the painting be removed from the exhibition, but that it actually be destroyed. The key reason for this, according to Black, is that Schutz has no right to the experience of black suffering. One immediately wonders whether German students required a right to Jewish suffering. So whether the West German students required a right to Jewish suffering to raise the question of the Holocaust and collective German guilt in the tumultuous years between 1967 and 1977. Why Dana Schutz should be any different is far from clear. Black's letter is so instructive because it makes a truth claim about a particular representation of suffering without carefully attending to the painting's own sensuous particularity. As Zadie Smith subsequently does in her response to Hannah Black and to Open Casket in a 2017 article in Harper's Magazine. The very premise of the claim made by Hannah Black confuses ontology with epistemology, that the representation was bereft of truth by virtue of the fact that the race of the artist was simply the wrong one. She had no right to black suffering. The claim has the status of an a priori over an a posteriori. It has an apodictic rather than a kind of apodictic sort of claim rather than one based on attention to the detail of the framing of its subject matter, its composition, use of color, texture, its brush strokes, and so on. It therefore rules out in advance the possibility of a critical judgment of the work's overall success or failure. The claim surely is not simply that the work cannot succeed, but that it also cannot fail. It cannot fail as well, because it can't exist. It ought not even be permitted to do so. It ought not be permitted to fail. It rules out in advance Beckett's claim that artworks can fail, and they can fail better, and they can fail worse. Artworks, as Benjamin and Adorno have both suggested, are constituted by both truth and falsity, and the work of criticism is to draw out their truth content of work on. And I'm actually saying the same thing about the Combahee River collective statement. There's truth and falsity there, and we need to draw them into some kind of productive relationship. The same thing goes for, let's say, nonverbal communications as well. When they fail better, they fail in such a way that we can learn something from them, including, for example, the conditions of their own impossibility. Perhaps at some level, all artworks seeking to express or represent suffering must fail insofar as such artworks remain deeply complicit in the world that produces such suffering in the first place. The artwork is in an inherently contradictory position in many different ways, and I can't go into them all now, but I think that this is something that doesn't even enter the discussion, which is a problem. Surely it's the role of criticism to make such judgments about the nature of such failures. Yet Hannah Black moralistically rules out such criticism in advance by advocating the painting's liquidation. And perhaps one of the things we can discuss in the period to follow is why criticism is important for the left's project. I mean, this is really crucial, given the role that that word plays in Marx's own works, especially his early ones. So this demand for the work's destruction is a logical conclusion of the radical particularism of identity politics, or the idea that identity-based groups are unified by certain experiences that other groups simply have no right to. The relationship is one suggestive, as I was alluding to earlier, of property ownership, yet a relationship also over-determined by a sense that the loss of such property entails, or would entail, not just a monetary loss, but an ontological one, a loss of being itself. From this perspective, claims or representations made by members of one group about another are not simply to be addressed by judgments and therefore criticisms, as we've seen with the Skye Gilbert case, because such claims or representations constitute hateful and harmful attacks on these very groups. This is also, for example, what came into play in the much discussed case of Rebecca Tuvel's March 2017 Hypatia article on the possibility of transracial identities, and an open letter signed by over 800 academics demanding its retraction. It's a retraction. Just like we mustn't have open casket in existence somewhere in some storage facility hidden away. We must also have this article retracted. We shouldn't even be able to look at it, read it, and judge for ourselves, and also possibly critically discuss it. If it is true that central to identity politics is a reified account of experience, then a much more promising approach to it, I would suggest, is to be found in Frantz Fanon's dynamic understanding of experience. Given that Frantz Fanon's work, especially Black Skin, White Masks, is so central to identity politics in general, and to Afro-pessimism in particular, from which, in fact, the main tropes, wittingly or unwittingly, of Hannah Black's letters seem to be drawn, it is unfortunate that Haider's imminent critique of identity politics remains confined to the US Black radical tradition, important as it is, without a doubt. But it's a highly specific nexus, and there is no glance at other traditions. And that's unfortunate, as I said, because Fanon really informs the kinds of arguments made by people like Hannah Black in this context. Or to put it another way, it is unfortunate that Haider doesn't seek to engage in an imminent critique of Afro-pessimism's own rather one-sided appropriation of this thought, of Fanon's thought. In what is surely one of the best accounts of Fanon's thought, Fanon's dialectic of experience, Ghanaian philosopher Ato Seshiotu argues that it is within a dramaturgical structure that we must seek to understand Fanon's narrative of liberation. Quote, thanks to this formal characteristic, he argues, Fanon's narrative can give credence to the apprehension of a historical object in its immediate mode of appearance, and yet prepare us for a comprehension of this object, that is to say, a fuller knowledge of its appearance and its conditions of intelligibility. Attention must be paid, therefore, to the very speech acts that constitute the often contradictory, because dramaturgical stagings of experience itself. Another way of tying this into some other things I said earlier is that, yes, you start with affect, for example, but that ought not to be where we stop. That there is, in a sense, a need to educate that affect beyond the immediacy of its reaction. Right? And I think this is really what dialectic is. It's a critique of, or negation of, every immediacy. So through a reading of The Wretched of the Earth, rather than Black Skin, Seshiotu charts the movement of experience beyond the Manichaean world constituted by the binary logic of colonialism itself, a logic sedimented in the very architecture and built environment of colonized space. Once the armed struggle commences, the colonial world, characterized, as Atu puts it, by an Aristotelian logic of mutual exclusivity, eventually gives way to a more properly dialectical and temporal logic of mediation, in which difference between colonized and colonizer is transformed into an internal differentiation of the colonized themselves. The becoming human of the colonized, right, the negation of the dehumanization of the colonized, not to say that the colonized are inherently, unhuman, but they have been dehumanized. The becoming human of the colonized corresponds paradoxically to the dynamic disclosure of difference within the colonized, rather than the static and reified difference constituting the Manichaean world of the colony. What's crucial here is the retrieval of the human entails the capacity of the colonized to, in a sense, subject themselves or one another to the very forms of domination and oppression that are seen elsewhere in, let's say, non-colonial societies, class structure in Europe, for example. This is a really important point. The immediacy of identity, based on the supposedly natural fact of race, now is fundamentally altered through what Marx called in the first volume of Capital, a transformation in the dramatis personae into a kind of non-identity. That is, divisions based on social class between a nascent national bourgeoisie on the one hand and the workers and peasants on the other come into view. Now we have class division and conflict within the new nation. So she goes to felicitously, I'm not going to be able to say this now at this point, calls this, very nicely, calls this the dialectical enlightenment of the post-colonial world. One in which, quote, it's a bit of a long quote, I'm nearly done and we'll finish shortly. Reason's triumph, the faculty of dialectical disclosure, is in Fanon achieved experientially through a corrosive destruction of the rigidity and simplicity to which a racialized apprehension of the world had reduced everything. Thanks to this bitter discovery of exploitative relations and distributive injustice as intra-racial facts within the race itself, within the so-called race, as human, all too human possibilities, the nascent post-colonial subject is ready for a veritable political and epistemic reorientation. This is really the nub, very heart of the argument, the interpretation. So now moving on, what is important to grasp is the centrality of a reified or static understanding of experience lying at the heart of identity politics. If contemporary identity politics can be understood as neoliberal, it is because it internalizes the logic of the value form at a particularly deep level. This becomes especially clear in the example of Hannah Black, where we find precisely what Sociotu calls the rigidity and simplicity to which racialized apprehension of the world reduced everything. It is such a racialized apprehension that grounds her demand for the destruction of Dana Schutz's painting. If the work opens up a world, then in demanding work destruction, Hannah Black nihilistically demands world destruction, the destruction of the structure of meaning and of sense which the work generates, but also the basis on which the very same work itself may be criticized, as exemplified by the oppositional response of black painter Parker Bright to open Casket. Going back to his response or responses, such world destruction at the same time then profoundly forecloses the possibility of the insurgent universality that Haider champions. Indeed, it forecloses the very possibility of politics itself. So, essentially, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to argue is that the way in which identity politics gets practiced is through an authoritarian closing down of spaces, I think both physical and mental, within which we can critically engage with both the world, but also questions of tactics, of strategy, and of ways in which we might be able to, or not, work with one another. So I don't think there's anything more crucial than that. And the last, the last thing I'd like to point out, if I can find it, is just one last paragraph, because I think this to me is so central. It is also about how we really address the institutions of liberal democracy. Just over the last 2 days, we see the extent to which it is in crisis. Core institutions are really hanging on by the skin of their teeth. Right? We see this in the UK with the Supreme Court decision, the recall of Parliament, and then that first day back, the kind of the antagonism which clearly characterizes parliamentary life. I mean, I think that antagonism is probably a little bit healthy because it actually shows what's at stake. And this false sort of gentlemanly demeanor is exactly that, it's false. But when we have governments like Johnson's that are, willfully disobeying and also threatening to further disobey the law, and then, well, what can you say about what's going on down south? It's truly outrageous. So I think we need to have a certain kind of response, more generally to the institutions, let's say then of liberal democracy. It's not just the kinds of cultural politics that are going on, which I think are quite against the spirit of democratic praxis, but the institutional response. I just want to say one last thing and then open it up. One of the things that I talk about is the idea of fascism arising on the basis of a failed revolution. So, if it's possible to speak of such a failed revolution, then we have to say it must be understood in the singular, not in the singular, but rather as several failed attempts at completing and realizing and transcending the bourgeois revolutions of 1789 and 1848 and 1871. I think this is really Marx's fundamental project: is the transcendence of these revolutions. So the task of the left must surely be to consider its future in light of these failures, these moments where the moment to realize philosophy misfired or failed. So it must look to its own melancholy past. But what does this mean? In the context of fascisms that undermine liberal democracy from within, on the backdrop of a combination of the ongoing crisis tendencies of a financialized neoliberal order and the looming threat of ecological collapse that we are now experiencing, and I'll be out on the streets tomorrow protesting, rather than a resigned dismissal of liberal democracy, the left must make significant efforts to distinguish itself from the far right's attack on these institutions. The right engages in what we could call an abstract negation, a simple cancellation of the institutions of liberal democracy in the name of natural hierarchies of various sorts. I think this much is very clear. In order to avoid what Ross Reed calls fascist creep and offer genuine alternatives, the left must take up a genuinely dialectical politics of determinate negation, which is to say it must simultaneously cancel and preserve aspects of the very liberal democracy targeted by the far right. It must struggle to defend and preserve civil rights and expand and deepen social rights while critiquing and limiting bourgeois property rights, while canceling the separation between the political and economic spheres, the very separation between liberalism's negative freedom and democracy and the principle of equality, which means also urgently rethinking and configuring the vital relationship between material production and social reproduction. The left must insist upon a thoroughgoing democratization of society. So I think I've gone probably way over my time. Thanks for your attention.